there has been discussion of late among the intelligentsia of Gen 5 OU that Alakazam is potentially on the chopping block for a suspect test. Now, this came as a surprise to me because while I am, of course, not opposed, it's not something that I would have really thought to lobby for because the way the policy works in Gen 5 OU at this point is that the stuff that's really fundamental to the tier, the Latios, Spikes, Rain, things like that, they have been pretty clearly demarcated as untouchable. So people have more thought to, like myself, have thought more to look at things that are that we can remove to make the dynamics in the tier more skill-based without really upending its identity. Because it's too much to just say, we're going to start with a brand new Gen 5 OU, even though I personally would be super okay with that, but I understand where it's coming from. So that's why we've gotten things like the Cloister test. It was one of the rationales for the Reuniclus test, that Reuniclus isn't really essential to the tier. And it's why people have looked at Volcarona, of course, and Thunderous Therian, which is also a topic of debate. So that was what was surprising to me about ZAM, is that it feels like a more fundamental aspect of the tier. And usually when people complain about ZAM, because obviously ZAM has been part of what has upended Gen 5 OU so drastically over the last decade plus, that it has inspired unprecedented tiering changes, like the whole Bring Exca Back movement just to limit spikes, just so ZAM will be more manageable, and Reuniclus. And shocker, that didn't wind up working. Not like we ever could have guessed that right from the beginning, but whatever. Anyway. So decade later, here we are with ZAM on the chopping block potentially. So what's interesting about it is that ZAM actually started as kind of a source of balance in the tier because with that built-in focus sash, it can take on any threat, besides Cloister, but that was part of Cloister's appeal, the fact that it gets past sash ZAM. But yeah, when Gen 5 OU for so long was characterized by, insane sweepers, how do you prepare for everything, everything's so overpowered, all that stuff, then ZAM was stability for more balanced teams, sand teams that were trying to take everything on, give yourself, a decent matchup so you can play the game. And Sash ZAM was a big part of that because it puts on so much offensive pressure, but it's also, you can use it defensively. You can hard switch it into a lot of things like... what's it called? Dragonite, if Sand is up, you just switch it right in. If it outrages, then you just take it out with HP Ice. If it DDs, then you just take the outrage the next turn. Things like that. You can check anything with it. With Sash, you can take a hit from Volcarona. With Psyshock, you hit it a lot harder than the Psychic that would bounce off at +1 after a Quiver Dance. But yeah, ZAM obviously went a lot further than just, defensive stability against late game Scarf Keldeo or whatever. And was an offensive weapon all its own. And it's very restrictive, and this is kind of Gen 5 OU 101, right? That spikes, rip into all its counters except for Bronzong, which is very specific, very limited. And the issue of ZAM also is exacerbated by its teammates, Reuniclus and Latios, in conjunction with spikes. So that's why I was surprised. It was like, well, of all the issues, Latios, ZAM, Reuniclus, spikes, how do we, Magic Guard, how do we land on ZAM specifically? So... the answer seems to be that Life Orb ZAM has been used a lot more recently. And when you throw that extra power on ZAM, it is way harder to check. Because yes, it's harder for it to, it's easier for it to be revenge killed. You can't switch it in as easily. But, getting ZAM is not that difficult because of all the passive damage, all the weak hits that it takes on. Now, actually, you have a little bit more freedom, in different ways. Because before, you can't switch ZAM into anything that might break that sash. But you can now just switch ZAM into like little HP Fires, HP Ices, and you're good to go. And those Psychics, those Hidden Power Fires or Ices, those Focus Blasts, those Grass Knots, if you want the more reliable anti-T-Tar option, are just destroying things. And even something like Bronzong or Spadef Skarmory that are usually very safe into regular ZAM, Life Orb HP Fire rips through them. So... or even something like Jirachi with Spikes down. Spadef Jirachi, which is otherwise a very flawed Pokemon, even that winds up not being safe. and you are just decking things from much higher ranges. The one thing about Sash Zam, as strong as it is that it requires the other team to be quite weakened, or you bring it out in the late game for you to be able to actually drop things with them and clean up, which is fair. And of course, it's exacerbated by what we're going to get into with the Zam factor are Zam's own traits. But it's exacerbated by how difficult it is to revenge kill when you have to hit it twice. Such a strong, fast Pokemon not being OKOable, to make up a dumb-sounding word, except for niche things like Scarf Garchomp Dual Chop, which was very popular back in the day, just for that, makes it very difficult. But with Life Orb, it's a new kind of difficult. And here's where we get to the Zam factor, and that is its speed. So Alakazam is the fastest Pokemon in Gen 5 OU without the help of a Choice Scarf or any other boosters. So on any given turn, unless you are running Priority or a Choice Scarf, then you are going second against Zam. So obviously every tier is going to have a fastest Pokemon. The thing that makes Zam so interesting is that it is also so strong, number one, and so difficult to take on through conventional measures. I.e., you cannot OHKO it with anything when it's running Sash, and whether it's Sash or Life Orb, you cannot dance around it with passive damage. So it's very limiting in this regard. And especially we should note Priority and Scarfers as being good against it. Yes, sure, but the problem with Priority and Scarfers is those are very anti-offense traits. And when you are running anti-offense stuff like that, then you are not really matching up well into the bulkier teams that Zam is so good on. Not to say that these teams Zam is used on are just plain defense. Of course not. That's a big part of their appeal, that they're bulky, but they also are very dangerous. But the point is that when they have these solid defensive cores that are very easy to come by with just one or two or three Pokemon, then you are not really threatening them with Priority or Scarfers. Those are the attacks that walls just bounce off of. You can say, oh, well, Scarf Garchomp Dual Chop, and you can say, okay, well, almost everything on a Zam team will wall Scarf Garchomp or do well against it. It's not like an offense team. Like, if you use Scarf Garchomp to check Volcarona, that works not just because you check Volk, but because the teams Volk is used on are very vulnerable to Scarf Chomp. The teams Zam is on are not vulnerable to Scarf Chomp, not in the slightest. So you have to consider things like that, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, here are its weaknesses. That's no more insightful than pointing out that Kyogre is weak to electric attacks. So yeah, with Zam being as strong and fast as it is, and the options against it being so limited against the teams that Zam finds itself on, you see how it's so polarizing, and how the options for dealing with not just Zam, but Zam teams are fairly limited. And obviously, this team factor goes both ways. You say, oh, well, Scarf Garchomp checks Zam, but it's not very good into the rest of Zam's team. Well, that's what the rest of your team is for. And yes, that's absolutely right. That's why things like Magnezone plus SD Gliscor are very popular alongside, what's-its-face, Scarf Chomp, because those excel in taking on these kinds of things. But it's still very difficult, and generally, Alakazam is dictating the pace of play, and it is making the demands on the opponent, and they are demands that are very difficult to meet on a consistent basis. So that's really where it comes from. So, where we were going with this. When you have Priority and Scarfers, which are so exploitable as your anti-Zam methods, you generally tend to thud into the bulky teams Zam finds itself on, right? So what do? You say, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to bulk it out. I'm going to bulk my team out. And that's where you get things like Bronzong or, like Chansey, Blissey stuff. You say, okay, well, I'm not going to outspeed it because, A, that's difficult to do without a Choice Scarfer, and B, the Choice Scarfers are very exploitable. Even the ones with, U-turn, like Lando, they're not really doing anything. You U-turn against a Zam, the Rocky Helmet Scarm comes in and chips your Lando. Yeah, no, to say nothing of the fact that they can't even switch in. So you have to sacrifice to get your Scarfer in against Zam, and then the Scarfer does nothing. So that is a winning proposition for the Zam. So you want to avoid all that. So you go bulky. As great as Sash Zam is, it is not excelling into super bulky Pokemon like Jirachi and Bronzong and things like that. Or even like a Spadef Scarm, it doesn't really break through at all unless it starts running Calm Mind, and that's a precious move slot. But with Life Orb, then yeah, you're not as ironclad into hardcore offense stuff, but that's generally manageable through other means. Like, yes, Alakazam is the best choice scarfer in the tier, choice scarfer in quotes, in that it lets you revenge kill pretty much everything while still being a good Pokemon. That's the thing. Like, we've talked about how limiting choice scarfers are, right? And that also applies in general. Like, why do I want to use a choice scarfer to just revenge kill this threat that, when this choice scarfer might just very well be taken advantage of after? So that's why you see a lot of Alakazam teams go without scarfers. Not always, but very often Alakazam is their quote-unquote scarfer because it bails you out against, whatever boosting sweeper, much like a scarfer would, while still being a great offensive Pokemon in and of itself. This is a common factor in metagames where there are a bunch of broken Pokemon and you're forced to use Scarfers to take them on. It's like, well, I'm using the Scarfer just to not lose to this Pokemon, not because the Scarfer itself is actually good. You saw this a lot in early XY, actually. So, yeah, you use Zam as a Scarfer and you don't lose to offense, but then you realize, oh, well, offense is not that difficult to manage, and I would like my Zam to be more threatening because Zam is so much more polarizing than any sweeper. Pretty much, because it's a lot more consistent. Like, yeah, Volcarona sweeps more terrifically, let's say, spectacularly, in the literal sense of the spectacle, but it's not consistent, not at all. Whereas Zam is the most consistent thing in the tier. But it's so consistent, people even figured out ways to use it without having to rely on Focus Blast, which is stunning. But, yeah, that's another thing Life Orb HV Fire does, by the way, hit Excadrill without relying on Focus Blast. And the downturn of Heatran means that you need Focus Blast less than ever, Grass Knot, you're taking care of T-Tar just as well if it's running Chople. So, my point is, you take Zam, you remove the Scarfer aspect of Zam, and you decide, okay, well, it's more consistent for the opponent to go all-out bulk to deal with Zam, right? Because offense is frail, can't switch into it at all, has to hit it twice, which is insanely difficult when it's so fast. So, offense doesn't like Sash Zam either way. So it's more reliable in general to run bulk and just kind of sit on the Zam, right? This is true for all sorts of, fast Pokemon that are offense killers. And then with Life Orb, you realize, oh, wait, this kind of destroys everything. Now, Life Orb Alakazam being so strong does not necessarily merit it as broken any more than it already was, And some people have already commented on this is just potentially a trend by people noticing, oh, hey, Life Orb Zam is good, which is something that has been noticed before. So this just might, be adapted to. And if Zam really is an issue, which, again, I'm not opposed to and has been, cited many times, then if Zam really is an issue, then you just deal with it regardless of the Life Orb set, because it's more those inherent traits that are warping the metagame. And it's not like Life Orb wasn't being used before. We're not exactly discovering fire here. So, yeah. That is basically it. The Zam factor is more or less the fact that Zam is so fast and so strong, which, okay, fine, but it's also so resilient against traditional ways of dealing with the fastest, strongest Pokemon in the tier. When you've got such a fast, strong Pokemon, usually it's going to be frail, so you can take it out in one shot with whatever revenge killing tool. And, or, as is the case for every non-Magic Art Pokemon, they're also very vulnerable to passive damage. So the fact that they can not get worn down by the permanent sand, not even get dug into by rocks, they switch into Toxic and Will-O-Wisp and Leech Seed. Not that Leech Seed is particularly common in modern Gen 5 but you get the idea. They have so many opportunities to switch in because passive damage is so important to keep offensive Pokemon in check, and then these Pokemon come in and take advantage of that balancing factor because that balancing factor doesn't apply to them. So by being able to bypass it, they gain a particular strength, and that other particular strength is not just in the eternal Focus Sash that Zam has, but in how it can run Life Orb without taking recoil. Anything else that's this fast and this strong, you run Life Orb, it's like, okay, well, you're losing 10%, and you're getting affected by sand. Here you have the freest Life Orb ever. It would have to run Sheer Force to be any more threatening. And if it did run Sheer Force, it would be vulnerable to sand and rocks and spikes and status. So even that would be more manageable, even though it would be stupidly strong. So maybe, but let's focus not on whether that theoretical will be more busted, but whether this one is busted or not. So that's pretty much everything I had to say. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I don't know if this is going to go anywhere. Getting people to agree on anything in Gen 5 OU is like pulling teeth. And, some people say, well, forget Zam, Thunderous T, Volcarona. But, yeah, we'll see. Either way, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.